Good morning. Glad to see all of you again. We're going to start on time because we have a very long program and I think a very exciting program. This morning you're going to hear from the epidemiologists whom one of the toxicologists yesterday said his aim was to put out of business. So we'll hear their side of the story. And we are going to start. We consider ourselves very fortunate that we have with us Leon Gordis, who some of you in the federal system I'm sure have encountered because I know he's been on numerous programs for the Federal Judicial Center. I guess that's where we first met, and is the author of a chapter in the reference manual, which is in the back there, if any of you want to pick it up. And who is a professor of epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. I think that's all I will say. His bio is in your materials. And Leon. Oh, and there's a handout in the back as well of the slides that he is going to be discussing.
Where's that?
I think Michelle just went to, yeah. So maybe you could just give it out for a second.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Margaret has told me that she's going to be a very tough taskmistress on time, so that's why I'm going to start, because I don't know if I get credit for the distribution time. So I have to be careful when I'm going to move with lawyers and judges. Just a couple of comments. First of all, I have had the pleasure of meeting some of you at previous courses and conferences, and it's nice to see you again. I hope that my presentation won't be too repetitious for those of you. I have tried to add some new material and to say things in somewhat different ways, but nevertheless, some of it may sound a little familiar to you. My charge this morning, as I understand it, is to, first of all, in 40 minutes, give you a doctorate degree in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins. And therefore, in order to accomplish that, I want to bring everyone to the same wavelength so that basically I'm setting the stage for the subsequent speakers in the morning. And so I hope you'll be indulgent with that. The other point I'd like to make is about this handout. This handout was FedExed to Margaret eons ago, I think on Tuesday. And since that time, the talk has gone through a few changes. So the result is, first of all, I had only selected some slides for the handout. And you'll see that, and I'll try to point it out to you as we go along. But secondly, some of these slides in the handout I've decided not to address in this talk. And particularly, there's a group of slides that might be of interest to you, at least my perceptions about expert witnesses. But that's not part of the talk anymore for reasons of time. And then you'll see that, so there are things in the handout that aren't in the talk, and now there are things in the talk that aren't in the handout, and I'm sure you'll be very flexible and understanding. Thank you. So, as you see, we're going to talk about causation and uncertainty in epidemiology. And we've tossed around the word epidemiology a lot yesterday. You're going to hear it more today, obviously. So the question is, what is epidemiology? What do we mean by that? And, but epidemiology is the study of how disease distributes in human populations and what determines differences in disease risk among different subgroups. What do we mean by that? Well, we know, for example, that there are people who are at higher risk for disease than other people. The question is, why is that? Why is it that people, let's say, with a family history have higher risk in terms of genetic factors? Or why is it that one gender may have a higher risk for a given disease than another? So epidemiologists thrive on trying to identify the reasons that different people have different risks of disease. The principle, and I don't know if the toxicologist would sit silently through this, but is if you want to know about adverse health effects in human populations, If you want to know about adverse health effects in human populations, you have to study human populations. And it's not to say that toxicology doesn't make important contributions, and you heard about that yesterday afternoon, but the ultimate test is not to see if we can have healthier rodents in the population, but if we can have healthier human beings. So that's basically the, okay? Now, epidemiology's uses, I've listed 3 of them here on this slide, to assess the community burden of disease, very important in planning health services, to identify the causes of human disease, and to study the effectiveness of different treatments. And in particular, our focus today is on identifying the causes of human disease, because that's what you're dealing with in tort litigation, is who caused so-and-so's illness to have occurred. One basic assumption that underlies epidemiology is that disease is not randomly distributed in the population. If disease was randomly distributed in the population, there'd be no point in studying different groups, because we all have the same rates of disease. So this is a very important principle. And here are some tongue-in-cheek facts about carrots. Nearly all sick people have eaten carrots. Obviously, the effects are cumulative. An estimated 99.9% of all people who die from cancer and heart disease have eaten carrots. 99.9% of people involved in car crashes ate carrots within 60 days of their accidents. 93% of juvenile delinquents come from homes where carrots are served regularly. And among people born in 1839 who later ate carrots, there's been 100% mortality. Now, amusing as it is, the question is, why is it amusing? What's missing here? If you try to actually analyze it and say, why is it amusing? And the problem is, we need to have comparisons. And that underlies how we do epidemiology. We're looking at an exposed group or non-exposed, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but we must have some comparative data. Now, I also want to show you this quotation from the Greek-Roman physician, Galen, who lived to see 129, these are estimated dates, to 199, and he wrote, he was a very successful practitioner, and he wrote, all who drink of this treatment recover in a short time, except those whom it does not help, who all die. It's obvious, therefore, that it only fails in incurable cases. Now, this has a theologic ring to it, because there's no way of disproving it. And therefore, what we have to have when we do epidemiologic studies is a testable hypothesis. A hypothesis that gives us the opportunity to refute it and to say it's wrong. There are 2 steps in epidemiologic reasoning. First, we determine whether there's an association between an exposure and a disease or adverse health outcome. And if we find there's an association, then we have to decide whether it reflects a causal relationship. And that's what I'm going to spend the next few moments on. So we're going to talk about that first step, determining whether there's an association between the exposure and disease. Well, how do we do this? I'm going to show you 3 study designs, very simply, just to put it in perspective. First is the randomized trial, which is often held up as the gold standard of truth. And Dr. Minor, whom we'll hear from in a short while, his particular expertise among many is in the area of randomized trials. And also I might mention that even though he's going to come on like he's only a country epidemiologist, a statistician, that's his wonderful manner, because he was born in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, but don't be deceived by that, okay? So anyhow, in a randomized study, we begin with a study population. They're randomly assigned. Theoretically and figuratively, it's by tossing a coin. We decide which treatment the person's going to get, and then we follow up how many die from the disease and how many don't die from the disease in each group. So if we wanted to do a randomized trial of women with breast implants, we would randomly take a population of women, randomly assign them to either have an implant or no implant, and look, let's say, connective tissue disease in both groups. Now, let me just say, in terms of this, is that why don't we do this kind of study? We don't do this kind of study when there's a potential toxic effect. But, did I miss something? If there's a potential toxic effect from the substance, the randomized trial, ethically, legally, and so on, cannot be done. So therefore, we need other types of studies. for identifying causal factors in human disease. But I'd like you to keep this design in mind when we go about comparing different kinds of studies during the day today. The next type of study design is the cohort design. And in a cohort design, we take a group of exposed people and a group of non-exposed people, and we follow them up for the rate of developing disease or no disease. In fact, you can almost have the same diagram as a randomized trial. What's the difference, though? They come from the same population, we hope, and they're exposed and non-exposed, but they're not randomly assigned to the exposure. And that is a critical difference between the two study designs, because it raises a lot of the problems that we have with observational studies on that one line, not randomly assigned. But other than that, the cohort and the randomized trial are, in effect, the same or very similar. Is that clear to everybody? If you have any questions, by the way, stop me.
Actually, don't you randomly assign in a de facto way?
Well, it's not really. It may be haphazardly assigned, but not randomly assigned. For example, if you are concerned about an industrial exposure, and you want to know whether that has caused disease in people employed in a certain industry, and you have a group of people who work for that industry in a comparative group, they weren't randomly assigned. They took the job for various reasons, mainly social reasons, cultural reasons, economic reasons, while they took the job, let's say, working with chemicals that might be carcinogens and so on. So it's not a random assignment. Random assignment means there's just like tossing a coin or random numbers in a computerized table, and that's the way the assignment is made. I think you're talking about a more haphazard thing. It's not predictable.
Okay.
Right. So if we were doing a cohort study of silicone implants and connective tissue disease, oops, go back. We would take a group of exposed women with implants, no implants, and then follow them up for connective tissue disease. And if there is an association, we would expect to see a greater rate of connective tissue disease in women with implants than in women without implants. Is this clear to everybody, even though I'm moving at a good clip? The third type of study design is the case control study. And in a case control study, we begin with cases, people who have the disease, and compare them to people who do not have the disease, and look at the proportion who are exposed, who have a history of exposure in both groups. So here, if we're doing a study of breast implants again, we start with women with connective tissue disease now, not with the implants, which is the exposure, but with the outcome, the disease of interest. So we begin with women with connective tissue disease, women without it, and look at the proportion who have had implants in both groups. And if there is a relationship, we would expect to see a higher proportion of breast implants in the women with connective tissue disease than in the women without it. Is that understandable to everybody? So these are the three basic types of study design. There are many variants on this, but I'm not going to talk about them this morning. So just a little review. In a cohort study, we start with and we compare exposed people and non-exposed people. In a case control study, as the name implies, we start with cases and controls. People with the disease, people without the disease. And then we compare the rates of disease in a cohort study. We look at the rates of disease in exposed and non-exposed. But in a case control study, we look at the proportions who were exposed of people with the disease and people without the disease. Is that distinction clear to everybody? Now, we can talk for hours about each of them, and we give whole courses on each of these study designs, but you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to do that. Okay. Well now, so we've done our perfect study. Now what comes next? Well, we go back to our first step in epidemiologic reasoning. We want to know, the purpose of doing the study is that we want to know whether there's an association between exposure and a disease or adverse health outcome. Is there an excess risk of disease in people who have been exposed? That's the question. And so we have to talk then about how we measure excess risk in these studies. And the first index is called the relative risk, which is very commonly used. And no matter what you read, you won't escape it in any of your cases. Relative risk, simple definition, it's the ratio of the risk of disease in exposed people to the risk of disease in non-exposed people. How do we interpret it? Well, if the relative risk is 1, and we go back to this, then it means that the risk in exposed people is the same as the risk in non-exposed, right? The numerator is the same as the denominator. So therefore, there's no association. If the relative risk is greater than 1, the risk is greater in exposed people than unexposed, it's a positive association, might be causal. If the relative risk is less than 1, the risk in exposed people is less than the risk in unexposed. It's a negative association, might be protective. Can anybody suggest what might be an example of a relative risk less than 1?
Exercise and heart disease.
Exercise and heart disease, a vaccine, for example, although smallpox vaccine, we have mixed data now on adverse effects, but in terms of protecting from the disease, that's right. So, what? Aspirin, right. So these are protective, and you would expect to get a negative relative risk. I'm not going to talk about the odds ratio, which is the index that we use primarily in case control studies, primarily, this morning. And you can just consider it an equivalent for most of your purposes. That you would, I'm sorry, that means that you would interpret it in the same way, the values of the, I'm glad you asked, that you would interpret it the same way we interpret the relative risk. There's more to say, but for reasons of time, I'm not going to go on unless you have a specific question. The third index is the attributable risk, and this is close to the legal heart, as you will see in a few moments. Now, what does the attributable risk mean? It says, the question the attributable risk is trying to answer is, how much of the risk of disease, let's say in exposed people, is really due to their exposure? Now, what does that mean? Well, let's assume, for example, that we're looking at a group of smokers as the exposure. And this is showing you schematically the magnitude of their risk of lung cancer. But even in people who don't smoke, there are some cases of lung cancer. So the question is, how much of this risk of disease in the smokers can we really attribute to their smoking? And so what we say is, well, there was a risk in the non-exposed people too, so we can really have two compartments. This is the risk not due to the exposure. It's the same as the risk in the non-exposed group, right? And added on, superimposed on that, is an additional risk due to the exposure. So that if we want to know how much of this risk is due to the exposure, we would take the total risk in this group and subtract from it the risk in the non-exposed group. Is that clear? Because we want to really get the value for this. We're going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes. So these are the ways we go about determining if there's an excess risk in exposed people. Now, then we've done the first step. If there is an association, we then determine whether the association reflects a causal relationship of the exposure to the disease outcome. And Dr. Weed is going to discuss this in depth, so I'm just going to make a brief comment or two. There's a list of guidelines that were formulated by an expert committee of the Surgeon General about 40 years ago, close to 50 years ago now, in trying to determine whether smoking caused lung cancer. And they've been revised, they've been shuffled, and so on, and I'm putting them in my own order on this slide. To me, the first one is a temporal relationship. And what does that mean? It means that if I think an exposure caused the disease, the exposure had to come before the disease developed. If I already have the disease and then I get exposed, obviously I think it would not make sense to attribute a causal relationship to that. And we have the principle post hoc, not principle, but the same, post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore, because of this. And if anything, there's a human tendency to overdo this one. That is, because it follows, it must be, we're all here now and the sun rose a few hours ago, that's why we're here, because of the sunrise. So obviously, it's a critical element, but it certainly is not enough in itself to determine causality. Now, this is the almost full list that Doug, I hope, will address some of this anyway. And just to take a moment, the strength of the association is the relative risk that I talked about just a few moments ago. Dose response you heard about from the toxicologist yesterday, that is, we would assume that if there's a causal relationship, the greater your exposure, the greater your risk of disease. This does not always happen because you can reach a threshold where it doesn't go any higher. But it still is a good rule. When you do find it, it's very helpful. And I think for reasons of time, I'm just going to restrict my comments. One is to say biologic plausibility, for example. We like to say, well, okay, you have these findings, but does it really make biologic sense? And I think it's a good test, except that we've had many examples where relationships have been found that were not biologically plausible because our biologic knowledge hadn't reached that point yet. So the relationship was sound. For example, when Sir Norman Gregg in the 1940s found, he was an ophthalmologist in Australia, when he found that he was seeing babies or infants in his practice who had cataracts, he attributed it to the fact that many of the mothers had German measles during pregnancy. But there was no basis for this. Nobody knew of any kind of negative effects from rubella virus or malformations or anything like that. And that information only came later on. So its biological plausibility is an important issue, and I won't talk about it, and maybe Doug will get to that. An important one is the extent to which we've considered alternate explanations. Have we really ruled out other possibilities to explain the association we've seen? One question that now let me go back. I can tell you that on this list, the question I have frequently gotten from your colleagues is, well, how many of these do you have to have? Do they all weigh the same? And the fact is they're not criteria, they're guidelines for our thinking. We're looking at the whole package of evidence and trying to come to a conclusion, I guess much as you do in a case in court. So there is no answer to that. And sometimes we don't have information about some of these items. The studies just haven't been done, or can't be done, for practical reasons. So one question I want to raise with you is, what are the legal and policy implications if we find a strong association, even if we cannot determine causation by using these criteria or guidelines? Because often we can't test them all. And I think this is something, if we had time, we could come back to. Now, I'm not going to talk about this for reasons of time. But now, the other question that comes up frequently is, what can epidemiology tell us regarding the cause of disease in a given individual? And I don't want to ruin your day, but the answer is very little. Okay? That's not what we do. We deal with groups, and we can tell you about groups. And therefore, of the questions raised yesterday in the toxicology talks, epidemiology is very good at answering the question, can substance A cause disease B? Has it been shown to cause disease B? That we're good at. But to say, did Mr. B's disease come because of an exposure to A? That's really not our business. And the problems that we have cross-culturally between science and law, or epidemiology and law, is that the witnesses are often pulled in to giving an opinion beyond the scope of the discipline. Yes?
This strikes me as a very important point. Are you saying that for what we do, class action is a better mechanism than individual lawsuit?
I don't know if that's a good question. I'm not sure that's an issue for me to address. I think the question is the expert opinion. The expert opinion can really tell you about the group. For any given individual, it's not going to be able to tell you. One of my colleagues, who's very distinguished in her own right, has said that she would never give evidence on testimony on causality for an individual, except that she's a physician, and she might give it on the basis of medical experience, but not on the basis of the epidemiology. She's an epidemiologist and a physician. So I think it's a very important issue that you don't want to push, I hope you don't want to push, the epidemiologists to go beyond what they're able to do as a result of what the discipline can offer you. I hope Doug will talk about this. Is there any questions? I'm sorry, yes.
Sounds like negative testimony.
Can't hear you.
Put it on.
Mike's not turned on.
Sounds that you could give a valid opinion that non-cause.
Yes, you could state that it has not been shown to be a cause. There's no, the good studies have been done and they haven't shown it, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But if there are studies showing that substance A can cause it, it's very hard to make the statement that it caused this person's disease. Okay? I knew it would be upsetting. Now, now I'd like to comment on, you see what I put in parentheses, that's a courtesy to my legal colleagues here. Inappropriate use of the legal system of using attributable risk for inferring specific causation. And this gets to this relative risk of 2. That is very popular in the legal business. Now, here's the same diagram I showed you before. The background risk here is 1, so that here it's 1, and therefore if it's 2, you can see that's half of the total risk, right? So if it's greater than 2, this is the rationale, if it's greater than 2, it's going to be more likely than not. But the fact of the matter is life is not that simple. We're not talking about, there are many factors. Most diseases that we deal with are multifactorial, and there's often interaction among these factors. And none of that is taken into account with this very simplistic calculation. Now, I know it's handy, but not everything that's handy is correct. H.L. Mencken, one of Baltimore's star products, said many years ago, for every problem, no matter how complex, there is always a simple solution, and it's wrong. Okay? Okay, now why could an association not be causal? Why could an association not be causal? First of all, we have the possibility that it's found by chance. And I want to show you some diagrams. And the model I use here is bendectin during pregnancy and congenital malformation. That was referred to yesterday, and of course is critical in terms of the Dalbert ruling. Here's a population of pregnant women, represented by the oval. Here's a subset of that group who have a child with congenital malformations. Here's a subset of that group who use bendectin in pregnancy. Now, we do a study. What are the possible findings? Well, we could find, theoretically, that every child who had a malformation was born to a mother who took bendectin. You can tell that by the overlapping of the circles. Would that prove causation? Well, it would be pretty suggestive, though, wouldn't it? Huh? You wouldn't expect this to be just a normal finding. So it might not prove it, but it would certainly be very, very strongly suggestive of a relationship. Or we could get this picture, that none of the children with congenital malformations were born to mothers who used bendectin, even though we had a sizable group using bendectin. Might indicate that bendectin protects, right? This is the other extreme. But of course, what do we usually find? We usually find a partial overlap. Just by chance, the two circles overlap. And what happens in a case in court is that the child who is the subject of the case comes from this overlapping area. And as I'll talk about if I have time, the appearance of an individual, particularly a child who suffered, who has a malformation, is very tragic, is overwhelmingly strong. It pulls at your heartstrings, and all the things we can talk about evidence, when it pulls at your heartstrings and you feel, and the jury feels they want to reward the family and so on for all their suffering and so on, these are very, very real things. But they don't argue the case of whether bendectin caused the malformation. The second is that we have biases in studies. Biases are errors in the way the studies have been done. Two of them deal, shown on this slide. One is selection bias, selection of the population. I don't know if Kurt will get into that at all, in generalizability. You might. And information bias. If we have different quality of information from different groups, and we find a difference in risk between the two groups, it may be not because there's really a difference in risk, but because we just don't have the same kinds of information on the two groups. So I just want to give you a feeling for that. And the third one is confounding, because you hear about that a great deal. I don't think most of these cases, toxic court cases where you have epidemiologists appearing, can be held without the word confounding being mentioned and discussed. What does confounding mean? Here is a causal association. A characteristic under study causes the disease. And this is we observe an association between the characteristic and the disease because, as shown by the arrow, there's a direct causal relationship. But it's also possible that it's not a causal relationship. We observe the association not because the characteristic causes the disease, but because a third factor, romantically dubbed factor X, third factor is associated with the characteristic under study and also causes the disease. So we have these two possible models. And why is it important? Well, for example, let's say the characteristic is cholesterol, increased cholesterol, and the disease is coronary heart disease. If this is the model, causal, then if I can get a person's cholesterol down, I can anticipate lowering the risk of coronary heart disease or myocardial infarction. But if this is the relationship and it's not a causal relationship, then it's possible that no matter what I do to the cholesterol, it's not going to change anything because factor X is determining it. And to show you an example from a study done by Brian McMahon, who is chairman of epidemiology at Harvard, this was done many years ago, but it's a good demonstration. He found an association between increased coffee consumption and cancer of the pancreas. This had a lot of notoriety in its day, but most of you are too young to remember this. So this is a causal relationship. And then here we have a confounded relationship, confounded by smoking. Why is it confounded by smoking? Because it's very rare to find a smoker who does not drink coffee. The two are very closely linked. Therefore, if you find an association of coffee drinking and pancreatic cancer, it could really be due to the fact that smokers drink coffee, and smoking is a known cause of pancreatic cancer. So, confound is eternally important. And within the legal setting, it's important to draw a distinction. We have confounders that are recognized, like cigarette smoking. And McMahon recognized it in his study, for example, and he analyzed for that. So it's a perfectly fair question to say, did he take recognized confounders into account? But then we have confounders that are not recognized. Was there a basis for suspecting a certain factor and it was not addressed? And that would seem to me to be a legitimate question. But what often happens, it becomes a pretext. And an attorney will say, well, but all confounders have not been taken into account. Well, what does that mean, all confounders? The world is full of confounders, potential confounders. We don't know what they are. If you're going to accuse an investigator, I don't mean you personally, but if an investigator is going to be accused of not having taken into account confounders, they should be relevant confounders. Factors for which we have some suggestive evidence that they could have played a role in interpreting this relationship. So I think this last one can be, to say the least, overdone. At the very least, it can be overdone. So in summary, what I've shown you so far is that an observed association can be non-causal due to chance, bias, or confounding, or it can be a causal relationship. Now, judges, in my experience, have asked a number of very pertinent questions, occasionally impertinent questions, but very pertinent questions, and which are not easily answered. Why do epidemiologic studies of epidemiologists often disagree even about a single study? And the public asks the same question, shown by this New Yorker cartoon. It's already become part of the public psyche that one day something carries an increased risk, the next day it doesn't carry an increased risk. So there are real issues of credibility here. And I think the differences it's important to point out, first of all, there are subjective elements in interpreting the data in epidemiologic studies. So, for example, Dr. Weed and I might interpret the data from the same study differently. It's not a recipe, it's not a cookbook. And there are a lot of other reasons. It could be the two studies don't agree because they were done in different populations, which had different characteristics, or the methodologies of the studies were different. So it is a very, very important question why we don't agree. And secondly, why do many scientists often refuse to commit themselves and seem to hedge in their opinions? And this cartoon shows random medical news for the New England Journal of Panic-Inducing Gobbledygook. And you see here are the variables here, and what it can cause, and which population. And he's very systematically giving another news report. But again, it's funny, but it really is a very serious issue we have, because I think you face it the way we do. That what's happened in the public psyche and consciousness really impinges on the jobs we do. It really does, in different ways. Obviously, we're doing different things. But we can't ignore what's happened in society because of these disagreements. And in the hedging, I will come to in just a moment. Now, I would like to suggest, you won't attack me because I'm not a lawyer, that law serves functions other than just getting at truth. And I put the just in parentheses as a courtesy. Now, I'd like to take you through this flowchart. It's in the handout, the final one. But the first question, if you're going to decide on compensation, now remember, I'm not part of the profession, so you have to be kind. Has an association been demonstrated? That, to me, is the first question. And it's either yes, it's been demonstrated, or it's no, it hasn't been demonstrated. If it's yes, then I would say then there's some compensation. Seems to be justified. But if an association has not been demonstrated, then we have to say, well, has it not been demonstrated because a good study has been done and didn't show it, or because no good study has been done? Now, if a good study has been done and there's no association, then we would say, do not compensate. If a good study has not been done, then we have to say, can a good study be done? And I think, if I recall correctly, Judge Weinstein faced this with the Agent Orange issue when there were no measures of exposure at that time for separating exposed and non-exposed people. And if I recall correctly, your conclusion was there was no evidence of the effect. Now, can a good study be done? So then we say, well, either yes, a good study could be done if we wanted to do it, or we can't do a good study. And if a good study can be done, then I would suggest we should have the study done. I'm not talking about who's going to pay for it and so on, a timeline. And if a good study cannot be done, then the question is, I would suggest we're going to consider compensation not on the basis of evidence, but because it seems the right thing to do. Now, I'm going to wind up because Margaret has given me my warning sign, even though I did take time for these questions.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Uncertainty. And this is, I think, a major issue. The National Research Council said the dominant analytic difficulty in using risk assessments for decision making is pervasive uncertainty. And this is said in a one closer to you. Now, it's an integral part of science, the uncertainty. Truth is often transient. Except for studies that I and my colleagues in this room do, everyone else's studies may be refuted tomorrow by better studies and more up-to-date data. So whatever I tell you in science, we know it's going to be just a building block in a wall of knowledge, or it may be refuted. This uncertainty is part of the game that we're in. And I know it doesn't help you when you hear scientific evidence that, well, you know, like they don't lie about Truman, you know, looking for a one-armed economist, because Mr. Sigley's economic advisor is telling him, but on the other hand. So, you know, so there are sources of uncertainty in the study itself, deficiencies in the design and so on, and I'm not going to go into these now for reasons of time. There's also the issue of the clinical versus population approaches. What I'm saying is, what I'm telling you about obviously is population approaches and groups and so on, but the individual clinical one, which I alluded to before, is very important. If it's a child brought into a court, it's hard to avoid it. And I'll just tell you that when I chaired the NIH consensus panel on mammography for women in the 40s, there were women in the audience who got up and said that, you know, they had a mammogram, let's say at age 41, they had a tumor found, it was removed, and now they're fine 6 years later. And they got standing ovations from the audience. But what's the problem? The problem is that that kind of evidence doesn't take into account slow-growing tumors, which might not have affected survival anyway. So you don't know if the woman's survival is really linked to the mammogram. And secondly, you don't have testimony from the other group, the group of similar women who had a mammogram and died of their breast cancer. They're not there to testify. So this is the problem with anecdotal evidence. And when you hear testimony of case reports, you have to keep that in mind. There's no comparison group, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Now, this part I'm going to unfortunately have to skip, but it really deals with the subjective nature of epidemiology. That epidemiologists, to some extent, cause the trouble themselves. And for example, whether we use absolute, this came up yesterday afternoon, absolute risk or relativism, somebody asked about the doubling of the risk, and it's not in your handout, unfortunately, because I put it in because of yesterday's discussion, but we'll see what happens later in the day. We talked about risk factors or causal factors. Is there a distinction between the two, or is it just a way of hedging? Statistical significance, which we sort of believe in very firmly, but I have seen studies with the same kinds of findings. And one says there were no statistically significant differences, and one says there were differences, but they did not achieve statistical significance. Now, what does that mean? I have always, this conjures up the image for me of the little data crawling up the wall, trying to achieve but being failures, underachievers. You know? It means that the data was supposed to achieve significance, and darn it, they didn't achieve significance. What kind of chutzpah is that, you know? And the point is that it reflects a preconception on our part. If the investigator feels that there should be a relationship, the investigator may well state it this way. If the investigator didn't have any particular biases, may state it this way. So you have to worry about how it is said to you. It's not all the same. Prognosis, for example. We do a trial of a new drug, and we find that mortality has gone to 93% from 94%. Well, that's nothing to write home about, right? We're not going to make a big deal out of that. But someone comes and says, oh no, look at survival. It's gone from 6% to 7%, 14 to 16% change. Which one's right or wrong? They're both correct, but there's a different message being transmitted in how the data are being given to you. So my point is that whenever you get data presented, you have to ask, why is it being presented this way? Could it have been presented another way that will be equally valid that I haven't been shown? And I just want to show you in closing that a lot has to do also with the perception, not only by the scientists and by the courts, but also by the public, of the nature of risk. Now here, this fellow is being told lifelong smokers have a 1 in 2 chance of dying of smoking-related disease, and he says, it'll never happen to me. And now, on the bottom here, he says, he's being told the odds of winning the Powerball lottery are 80 million to 1, and he says, this could be my lucky day. And there's a very important message in this, that depending on whether the outcome is attractive or not attractive, we may view the same probability very differently in how it affects our personal lives. And so in closing, from Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, he said there is no such uncertainty as a sure thing. And since my time is up, thank you.
We have some time for questions, so, and we do have some mics to give you if you're going to ask a question, which I hope works.
Yes, not in the prognosis part, which is,
Thank you.
right.
Could you just state your name?
I'm sorry, Gisela Cardone-Ely from Miami. And my question deals with, does the director of a study, and I realize that there are sometimes teams of people, how do you protect from your personal biases other than just blind studies? There is a human component to your direction. What is it you want to look at, and how do you do it? How do you protect against your own personal bias?
Well, I should let Dr. Miner comment because, as I said earlier, his expertise is in randomized trials. But let me just make an initial comment that with all the studies, cohort, case control, all the guidelines we build in for doing the studies are designed to protect these studies against our preconceptions. Now, preconceptions are not a bad thing, because if I didn't have a preconception, which drug might be better than the current one, you can't test every drug in the world. So you need a preconception to try to give you an idea of what you're going to study, or which exposure might be causing a disease. But once I decided to do the study, because of my previous idea, then I have to take all means to shelter the study from any biases I might inadvertently introduce. And that's why we have Dr. Miner's wonderful textbook on clinical trials, other books that are out on this subject, journal dealing with clinical trials. Kirk, would you like to add anything to it?
Well, I would think the main thing really has to do ultimately with peer review and publication, because there has to be checks and balances.
Right.
So if it's just unpublished, I don't know that I would be wary of whatever biases we bring to it.
So you would be suggesting that in a court, one should be wary of unpublished data.
Absolutely.
Right. And, yes.
My name is Ted Rothstein, and I just wanted to point out the importance of making sure that the controls are legitimate controls. There was a recent study some years ago on Alzheimer's disease showing a correlation between using aluminum pans in this condition, and it was based on the fact that autopsy studies showed increased aluminum in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's. It turned out that case controls were people who died in motorcycle accidents, and they were in their 20s, whereas the Alzheimer's patients were in their 80s. And when they repeated this study, they found that if you used age-matched controls, there was no difference basically in your lumen concentration. So you have to make sure you're comparing apples with apples, not with oranges.
You're absolutely right. And the selection of controls is one of the most difficult, of appropriate controls, is one of the most difficult problems in epidemiology. That example that you're citing seems so obvious that it's hard to believe they weren't aware of it.
And it was published.
Yes, no.
Any other questions? We'll have a chance to hear from Dr. Gordis again. Oh.
I'm still behind key bells, fellow detectives. I'm still struggling with your comment, which I think is the most valuable for what we do. That is that your expertise is a limited value in an individual case. Does that mean that an expert epidemiologist who offers to testify as to causation in an individual case is overdriving his headlights a little bit?
Well, I don't want to condemn anyone's motivations or quality of action, so let me put it this way. I think he could testify in an individual case about whether this substance is definitely causal, in general. When you're asking him to testify, did this person's disease arise because of an exposure to that substance, then I think it's more of a challenge. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, can I add something to that? But that does suggest, of course, that a judge who asked an epidemiologist, and do you, as a reasonable certainty, have an opinion about causation in this case, and the epidemiologist says, I can't answer that question, that's not a ground for excluding the epidemiologist who also is talking about general causation. And I've seen some cases like that, too. There's a question in the back.
Could I just make a supplementary comment? Epidemiologists can provide very useful information. For example, my name is Joel Cohen. Suppose you know the exposure or the dose, and suppose your epidemiologist can tell you that in a population of people who have received that level of exposure, 90% come down with the disease. Even though that's a population statement, it's very relevant to your case. And you can assess the relevance of the case. If you know what the exposure is, and 10% of the people come down with the disease as a result of a low dose or no exposure, that's also relevant. So I think Dr. Gordis is too modest about the contribution that epidemiology can make. It can tell you whether A, the causal factor, alleged causal factor matters, and B, where is the person on the dose response curve if you have that information?
I agree with you, and also in terms of whether what we heard yesterday with the toxicology, is the window, is the latent period between the exposure and that one that we observe in populations. So that would be another one. But it's not the same as saying, did this person's disease come from this exposure? That is pushing it, in my view.
Is there anyone who hasn't published? Every time you get an expert, it seems like they can't be working or treating people or doing anything. You should get a resume of about 30 pages where they publish stuff, and how do we determine if that which they have published has been subjected to relevant peer review, decent peer review, or whether they are false?
That's a good question. I have some, in the handout, there's some slides of personal views of how to look at expert witnesses. And one thing is, I would say the biggest hazard is that he doesn't do any work because he testifies all the time. The publication is his work. I mean, this is the issue of, it's part of doing research to have it peer reviewed and to, if there are criticisms or fatal flaws in the study, to have them picked up. Now, there are journals that are well known having excellent peer review. And there's a hierarchy of
So you
journals.
say peer review, if another scientist examines his article and writes a response or an evaluation of that article.
Well, this
Sometimes
is-
they just try and dump it and say, this is in a medical journal, I wrote it, is it a peer
Yeah, but I'm
review?
saying that there are gradations of journals in terms of the quality of peer review, which are well recognized. I don't know if anybody wants to put them on paper in terms of hierarchies of reviews. So obviously, I don't think you'd be in a position to be looking into it in depth. For example, if you have a paper, it doesn't mean it's always truth, by the way, but the New England Journal and JAMA are recognized as being very high-quality journals, among others, with excellent peer review processes. I think the issue that your question bears on, and it came up yesterday, is whether you want someone who's been working in that field is that the person you consider an appropriate review or witness? Or does the person can come from a different field and just have the expertise and look at it with less attachment to a certain point of view in the field? And I think you have a difficult challenge to make a decision. That's the whole thing. But if I see a person who earns 90% of his living being an expert witness, I would have grave doubts about that person. Or does that person have the ability to say, how many people disagree with me in my position? So I've tried to put some of that in the handout. It's not a foolproof anything, but just some random thoughts. It's a very good question.
The interesting question about the fit between the tort system and your knowledge base, and you were talking about the disjuncture, and then the question about the group-based or class action litigation. If we start with a legal system that only looks at the individual with a tradition there, now we have the technical capacity to think about it as group-based. I guess the question would be whether we're better thinking causation in aggregate instances. How much are you prepared to talk about uncertainty in individual instances, or would the discipline from which you come suggest that law ought to shift to track your capacity to look at populations which we did not 100 years earlier have the capacity to do?
If I fully understand your question, then you're saying, for example, in a class action suit, would the members of the class...
Current tradition is still to ask about
individuals, no, I understand.
Even in a group-based litigation.
Yeah.
What I'm questioning is, you're telling us, look, I can show you things we didn't understand 100 years ago that we now understand with reframes, and we're in a building block process. So I'm reflecting back and asking, well, gee, is my unit of inquiry the wrong one, or not the only one, or not the ideal one, given the knowledge base and the way in which you're now engaged in explaining relationships that heretofore I could not understand because I didn't have the capacity to screen the population or see the associations. Should our concepts shift in relationship to you rather than you say, look, here's where the disjuncture is?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it except to say that if I can make a comment as a witness about the group, the risk in the group, and you have a class in a class action suit, then we have to ask the question whether the findings of the groups that have been studied are applicable to that group. Is that group selected in some unusual way? So you still have to deal with this uncertainty, but it might make very good sense to do it that way. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now hear from Douglas Wee of the National Cancer Institute. And he has distributed a paper that he wrote for this presentation, which I hope you looked at, and he's going to be talking to us about causation and epidemiologic perspective.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Well, let me just say I'm very pleased to be here, very honored. I was a little bit worried. Not worried anymore after that extraordinary foundation that Dr. Borders provided to you on sort of the sort of nature of epidemiology and some of the important problems. Really shouldn't have been worried. I was in Ireland last week, and my Irish colleagues told me that there are really only two worries in the world: whether you're well or whether you're sick. If you're well, you don't have any worries. If you're sick, you only have two worries: whether you're going to live or you're going to die. If you live, you don't have any worries. If you die, you got two worries: you're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell. If you're in heaven, you have no worries. And if you're in hell, you'll spend so much time shaking hands with your friends, you won't have time to worry. I'm a little bit worried about the evaluation sheet. We have these at the Cancer Institute. We run a summer program, and I know that, so I want you all to be real kind to us. I mean, there's no question about Leon. And now let me tell you a story about evaluation. I got one back once. You know, it has the sort of check mark things, and then it has the written piece in there too. And someone said, if I only had 1 hour left to live, I want to listen to Dr. Wee. So I turned it over and he said, because only he can make an hour seem like an eternity. Let me start off, not with the slides, not just yet, because as Margaret said, I did put a little piece together about this. It's what I call an epidemiologic perspective on causation in 5 parts. And I was a little bit worried about this sort of disconnect. I haven't spent much time in my career thinking about the problem from your perspective, but I certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about causation, maybe 20 years now, thinking and writing about it. So I structured the paper around 5 quotations, and I thought what I'd do just to start off with, so when you come back to this, if you read this later, you'll sort of understand the context. And the 5 quotes really do a nice job of sort of marching us through what we'll then be talking about on the slides. The first quote is that there are 2 sides to every question. This was a quote from Protagoras, the guy that invented the protractor, found the protein, and from which we get the word agarus. The ass of an angler. There are 2 sides to every question, and when it comes to causation, it's exactly correct. There are 2. We can think about this in terms of general causation and specific causation, or we can, and for my purposes today, I'm only going to talk about general causation because I agree with Leon. This is not something that epidemiologists are expert about, and part of the reason for that is that we haven't thought about this very much. I mean, it's not that we couldn't think about it, but we just haven't thought about it. So don't expect folks within that discipline to have spent much time providing a sort of basis, a foundation, theoretical, methodological, or otherwise, for answering the question. It's not saying we couldn't do it, and we'll come back to sort of potential research questions at the end of this, and that might be an excellent research question for us to pursue. Anyway, so there are 2 sides to every question. That's the first thing. You've got your reasons for understanding general causation, and we have our reasons for understanding general causation. You need an answer to the question of general causation, as I understand it, because you need an answer to the question of specific causation. We need an answer to the question of general causation because we want to go out and prevent disease in populations, and that's why we need an answer. So it's different reasons for answering the same question. I believe that the question is, in fact, exactly the same question. And so let's go to the second quote in the paper. Habit is the enormous flywheel of society. This was that this process was sort of first developed in the 1960s. It has effectively not changed since then. So it is a habit, and it is enormous inertia in our practice. Now, the third quote that was on page 6 is, only the wearer knows where the shoe pinches. This is an Old English proverb. With a name like Weed, you can appreciate why I went to the Old English. This means, in the language of causation, those of us who use this method have a pretty good idea, if you think about it, where the problems of this method are. And I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time defining the problems of the practice of causal inference, causal judgment, causal decision-making in epidemiology. Now, the fourth quote is from Martin Luther King, and he said, all progress is precarious, and the solution of one problem brings us face to face with another problem. And that is to emphasize that there are a number of problems we need to solve, and these problems are related to one another. And then finally, the fifth quote is all about the future. This is by Ursula K. Le Guin, one of the great contemporary women science fiction writers. And she said, morning comes whether you set the alarm or not. So the future is on the pike. It's coming down here. And we're going to have to work together to identify how to solve some of these problems so that your answer to the question of general causation and our answer to the question of general causation can be better answered. So, with that brief introduction, let me start with the slides. I like to start with this one because, I apologize, because this was actually a direct representation of my very first job. I got a first job at advertising Western wear. No. Not really, of course. Actually, what I want to focus on, I don't have a pointer here, but it's okay, is that little box down in the right-hand corner. Surgeon General, as Leon pointed out, 1964, Surgeon General said, smoking causes lung cancer. They also said smoking causes laryngeal cancer, and they also said smoking doesn't cause bladder cancer and it doesn't cause esophageal cancer. What I would like to talk to you about today is how do you do that? Someone would say, so tell me, how do you do it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. The practice of causal inference in epidemiology. Now, as you can appreciate, it's going to be a little more complicated than that. There are three ways to think about this problem. So this is the problem of causation, the problem of general causation from our perspective. You can think about this thing as a methodology. You can think about this as, in fact, a practice in which people use those methodologies. And then, of course, you can think about this, well, I shouldn't say of course, from a more theoretical or philosophical perspective. We are talking about causation here, and that is a problem that has been examined and identified in the philosophical literature for 2,000 years. We're not going to go there today. That would be an interesting thing to do. We're going to focus primarily on the methodology and the practice of causal inference in epidemiology and public health. Now, let me tell you that in a bit more detail. When I think about the methodologies, these are what I call the interpretative methodologies of public health. These three methodologies all have the same kind of input to them. That is a bunch of studies, a body of evidence. Studies that are sometimes typically epidemiologic, but may also be from biologic or lab-based studies. And I take those studies, and I'll show you an example of this, so we're going to build on this. So the first methodology that we use is what we call systematic narrative review. That is, you presumably begin this process by systematically reviewing the literature and ensuring that you in fact have all of the evidence that's relevant to the question. That's the first step. It's a very important methodology. The second one, which is not used a lot, but it still might be used, is the meta-analysis of observational studies. We'll come back to how that's defined and how that method is used just very briefly. And then, when you talk about causation, you always talk about these criteria-based methods of causal inference. Hill's criteria from 1965, Surgeon General's criteria from 1964. I understand explicitly that they're not exactly criteria, but that's the language that we use in epidemiology. So if they're referred to as such, it doesn't mean that we hold them to be criteria, but we still call them criteria. Let me go into a little bit more detail. I'm the reviews editor for the Journal of National Cancer Institute. If you send a review article to me, within which that review article, you may address this question of general causation. So from our practice perspective, we have folks in the discipline who say, I'm going to review the literature, and specifically for the purpose of answering the question of general causation. If you do that and you send that review to me at the Journal of National Cancer Institute, the #1 oncology journal in the world, I will expect you to have followed this set of methodologies. I will expect you to have told me the purpose of the review, whether you're going to address causation or not. You might not want to. You say, I'm just going to address what research needs to be done. I'm not going to talk about causation. I need the purpose. We need the methods that you use to search the literature. If you included or excluded literature, we need to know about that. We need to know how you're going to evaluate validity within your studies. If you're talking about causation, which of the criteria did you use? Did you use meta-analysis, and what are the recommendations that you made? So this is an example of, we're talking about the methodology of causal inference. This is one piece of it, and this is a paper that I wrote about that methodology. So we're still sort of in methods land. We haven't quite got to the practice yet. We're thinking about our foundation, which is, I think in the judicial case as well, a foundation that is in the written literature. This is our methodologic literature. Here's, for example, from up to about 1996, the papers that have been written about this problem of causal inference and the methodology of causal inference. If you are a student of epidemiology and you were to say, I want to find out what these methods are, I would say, go read these papers. Now, there are a few more papers, but there are way too many of mine since 1996. It's important that you see the two bolded ones over on the left-hand side. The Surgeon General's Public Health Service report on smoking and lung cancer in 1964 and Hill's criteria paper published in 1965. Why do I bold these? Because interestingly enough, this is quite literally true. Again, if you were to write that systematic review in today's literature and say to the world, I'm going to address the question of causation, it is perfectly legitimate, in fact it's encouraged for you to say to me, I'm using Hill's criteria from 1965. Now not everyone does that, but the interesting thing about that I found is that nothing has changed since 1965 in the practice and the methods of causal inference in epidemiology. The very fact that I can say in my paper, I'm going to use a method that was basically invented 37 years ago, and that's fine, is an interesting statement itself on the nature of progress within our discipline. I know of no other methodology like this one that has remained so stagnant for such a long period of time. Nevertheless, that is what we have. That's what we do, that's what we use, and it's the one that we're going to have to consider in some depth. Here they are. The causal criteria, the causal guidelines, like I said, they're not really criteria, although temporality is in effect a criterion. The exposure really does have to precede the disease if you want to make a claim about causation, but the rest of them are not typically considered criteria per se. Nevertheless, they're important guidelines. You can see that in 1964, the Surgeon General's criteria is a subset of the criteria that Austin Bradford Hill published a year later. Hill basically expanded out the ones that the Surgeon General was using. Picture of Austin Bradford Hill. He was one of the great early biostatisticians and I guess in a sense epidemiologists. He was the designer of the first randomized clinical trial in medicine. He was a great teacher. He wrote Principles of Medical Statistics in 1937. A great teacher. Sir Richard Dahl was one of his students. So that's the sort of methodology side of causal inference, and we'll come back to this in a bit. Let's now talk, we have a literature about this methodology. As I explained to you, it's a rather stagnant literature. It's interesting, you might say, what do you mean stagnant? We wrote all those papers since 1965. Bottom line is that if I do the practice today, I can ignore everything that happened since 1965, and no one will say a word to me. In fact, I can write that systematic review and not tell you what method I'm using. That's okay too. That's not okay if you send it to JNCI, but in a lot of journals, that's okay. I can use, in a sense, a subset of those criteria, whichever ones I want to use, define them as I want to use, and that's okay. I'll show you examples where sort of this practice is today. So the causal inference now, if we think about it, is what we actually do. We apply these methods, the systematic review, meta-analysis, and causal criteria, by investigators, individuals. I can write a paper about a particular causal agent and publish it, or institutions, the Institute of Medicine, NRC, the NIH Consensus Conference. There are a variety of groups that get together and say, we're going to address this question of causation. So this is the kind of practice, and these are published, as I mentioned, in review papers, editorials, textbook chapters, technical reports, not all of which are peer-reviewed, not technically speaking, interestingly enough. But nevertheless, that's where this practice takes place. Let me give you an example. Just one of literally thousands of examples in the literature. So the topic in and of itself is not critical to you, although I don't know if there have been any cases about this or not, but nevertheless, here is an example of one I know in considerable doubt. These are the studies that were published from 1974 to 1994, so on alcohol and breast cancer. So if the question came up, does alcohol cause breast cancer? These are the studies that go into these three methodologies that I was telling you about. These are the studies that Leon explained to you in their structure. We didn't say much about ecologic studies. We'll sort of discount those for now, which is reasonable. But these are the case control studies and all the cohort studies on the question of alcohol and breast cancer published from 1974 to 1994. So one would expect in this systematic review that the individual, in fact, found all these studies and is reporting on all these studies and is not excluding some of them, as an example. So those are the studies. And here's where then you write your causal inference. This is where you make the causal claims. On the left-hand side of these are the papers that were written from 1985 to 1994, include some technical reports, in which the question of alcohol and breast cancer was asked. This is what we have done research on, which is how do people go about doing this practice of causal inference, and you do that by examining that literature on the left-hand side. Here's an example from one of the most famous, notoriously famous cancer epidemiologist, Ernst Wiener. And in 1989, he had an opportunity to write a review. It would be very common for someone who had studied the subject of alcohol and breast cancer, one of those 60 investigators, to write a review. And so he wrote a review, and he made claims about causation, and this is what he said. And this is how he did it. He said, at that time, there were, as you can see up there in the right-hand corner, about 18 studies that had been published, And he said, well, 7 of those 13 were positive, and 4 of the 5 cohort studies were positive. He said that argues against consistency. And consistency is one of the things that Leon mentioned we'll come back to. And he said, very weak associations, they're prone to the confounding that Leon talked about. Notice dose response is tucked in there, dose response patterns are not consistent. He talked about specificity, he talks about temporality and looks at the ecologic studies. He looks a little bit at the criterion of coherence, which he combines with biologic plausibility, and then he makes his conclusion. This is how it happens. This is how it works. And you make the conclusion, and he said, look, as far as I'm concerned, we evaluated all of these, we used these various guidelines, and as far as we're concerned, our evaluation does not support consumption as a factor, as ideologically important. Basically what he's saying, we don't see this as being a causal factor. There's an association there, but no causation. Just an example of the practice, how it takes place in our published peer-reviewed literature. Now, now's the time to sort of think about these in somewhat more detail. Are y'all clear about the context here? From our perspective, how we go about doing it. So now let's talk about a little bit about these, and sort of a way, what I think is a pretty good way to think about it. I like to think about these in sort of 2 senses. One is that there's a definition for each one of these, and another that's just a rule of evidence or rule of inference for each one of them. Let me tell you what I mean. So for consistency, what does that define? How is that defined, or what does it refer to? It refers to the extent to which I use the same word, which is a really bad idea, that the extent to which the findings in all of those studies are consistent with one another. What kind of problem am I looking at? I know you can't see this, but here is the question of consistency laid out. These are all those case control studies, and the question is, are those values consistent or not? That is the answer. That is the problem of consistency. That is what it refers to. Now, what is the rule of evidence? Remember I said everyone has a definition. What's the rule? Well, the rule is pretty simple in a sense. It says that the more consistent the findings, the more likely the association is causal. Now, you notice that's not very clear, but that's the rule that we have right now. We'll come back to this. Let's take another look at, go back just a second, strength of association. As Leon said, what does that refer to? It refers to the magnitude of the relative risk. Go back to the example. What does this mean? What this really means is that if I have this column here, my thinking has to be, what is the summary relative risk from all of those studies? If I could find a way to quote-unquote average them, and in fact that's what meta-analysis does very nicely when you can apply it, what is the overall magnitude of the relative risk of that body of evidence? And just to make life a little bit more complicated, these are just the case control studies. Those are the cohort studies. There's 2 questions, consistency and strength, are applied to precisely the same 2 bodies of evidence. So I have to answer it for the case control studies, and I have to answer it for the cohort studies. And it is not possible to do the meta-analysis across both of them. So I'm stuck with sort of 2, not stuck, but that's just the way it is. So that's consistency and strength. Now, biologic grading is just another way of saying dose response, and the toxicology colleagues yesterday explained to us what dose response was all about, and they find that a very fascinating subject, and it is a very important subject, and it fits into this context precisely in this way. Now, let me just point one thing out. I have put these in an order. I'm not suggesting that this is my priority order. It is just an order. And we'll come back to this. How do you prioritize these? We're just going through each one. Biologic gradient dose response, I'm not going to belabor that one, except to say it is the rule of inference goes like this. The more the association looks like when the exposure increases, the risk increases, the more likely the association is causal. And from the strength of association, just to back up on what's the rule of inference there? Well, again, it's something along the lines of the larger the relative risk, the more likely the association is causal. Is there some threshold for that? Considerable amount of controversy about that. The answer is not 2. We'll come back to that. Specificity, I won't go into only because it's more appropriate in infectious disease, but it is used in chronic disease. Some temporality we've talked about. Plausibility and coherence. Plausibility is a really important one. This is the quote-unquote criterion in which we say, so does this association make biological sense? And how do you answer that? By opening the window into another body of evidence, the evidence that comes out of laboratory-based and biological studies. So in epidemiology, we have traditionally, at this point in the analysis, said, let us go look into the biologic literature and see if, in fact, there is such a thing as a mechanism, if we can fit this association, whether it's smoking and lung cancer, alcohol and breast cancer, aluminum and Alzheimer's disease, there are thousands of examples, into what we know about biology today. Again, evidence-based. Coherence, some folks use that synonymously with plausibility, but in the old days, when Hill invented that term and when the Surgeon General used it, they were looking at it as a sort of broad sense that said, does everything fit together? Sort of a common sense notion of coherence. Experimental evidence is really nice when you have it, and there are ways to do prevention trials, but typically we don't have randomized prevention trial evidence for the question of general causation, and so we have to make decisions in the absence of trials. An analogy is what most folks would probably argue is a very weak sort of criterion. This says something like, well, if smoking causes lung cancer, then I guess maybe smoking might cause another cancer. That sort of analogy, that sort of argument. So that is a sort of primer. Any questions about that? That's sort of a primer on what it is we use. Now let's talk a little bit about how do we actually go about using it. So we talked about those two. Oh, I'm sorry. When we were talking about dose response, here's a good example of meta-analysis applied to several studies that produce a dose-response curve. And you can see that the more alcohol consumed, the relative risk goes up. This is a pretty nice example of a dose-response curve that came out of a meta-analysis of several of those studies. Well, you might ask, well, why don't we put these two things together? We have this methodologic literature, and we have this practice of causal inference where we use the methods. What does the methodologic literature tell us about the method? Well, it's really pretty interesting. Depending on who you talk to. If you talk to Ken Rothman, he says, well, these things are garbage, we shouldn't use them anyway. Well, that's okay, but that's what people actually use, so that's not very helpful. Some folks have said, well, whatever you do, don't use them as a checklist. Okay, still not very helpful. I mean, I still have to go through and examine them, and I promise I won't put checks on the paper. As we mentioned, it's not a list of required conditions, with one exception being temporality. Each obviously has some exceptions. Each has a boatload of underlying assumptions about the rule. Remember the rule that we'll come back to? Many are sort of interconnected. And there's a sort of, let's talk about priority here. There's sort of a priority suggested by how these are discussed in textbooks and how they're used in practice. Let me show you what I mean. In all epidemiologic textbooks published between 1970 and 1995, everybody in the textbooks talked about strength of association, temporality, almost everyone, consistency, plausibility, and dose response, and specificity. So in the textbooks in which we learn about these methods, those folks writing about those textbooks have told us, well, these are the ones that you think about primarily, and the other ones you don't think about so much. Now we then looked at those 14 reviews. Remember that one slide that showed the 14 reviews on the left-hand column? We said, so what did people actually use when they did those reviews? Well, everybody uses consistency. Pretty much everyone uses strength. Most everyone uses or discusses, when I say uses, discuss it within the context of a causal assessment or analysis. The dose response. Most everyone talks about biologic plausibility, and now we're down to about a third of the people talked about specificity. Interestingly, only 4 people actually use the criterion of temporality in their causal assessment, and then the rest of them fall off rather quickly. Is this sort of a fluke? I don't think so. We looked at 9 reviews of smoking and cervical cancer, exactly the same pattern. Consistency, strength, plausibility, and dose response are the big ones. The rest of them aren't. We looked at this in vasectomy and prostate cancer. We looked at a variety of examples, and this is a pretty common practice. You've got these big 4 up there that almost everyone uses, and pretty much you don't find them using the other 5 in the list. Well, so that's a sort of primer on the practice of it. Now, I promised I wouldn't talk about this in great detail, but it is interesting to me, just to bring up one issue. It is interesting to me that you will never see this in the literature, in which an investigator says, I'm going to go and examine causation. Let me tell you what my definition of a cause is, And then after I give you that definition of a cause, I'll tell you what criteria or conditions I'm going to be used to examine that causal factor. That is something that we have not done in our discipline overall. We have a methodology and a practice that is not literally based on a theory of causation. It might be considered an esoteric issue, but this is actually a really important issue. Well, you might argue there are different kinds of causes, and maybe there are different conditions for identifying different kinds of causes. Are there different kinds of causes? Yes, there are things called necessary causes, sufficient causes, component causes, a variety of notions of causation traditionally in the sort of theoretical and philosophical literature. But like I said, we're not going to go there. So now I promised I would show you some problems, talk to you about some of the problems, because I think there are some incredible problems within our discipline. Now, this is a problem that is particularly important for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. This is the problem of why is it that in the review, in the literature itself about these methods, we say, look guys, if you want to write a good review paper, this is how you ought to do it. Why is it that people don't do it that way? It's quite common to see literature reviews in our published peer-reviewed literature in which there is not a systematic approach. Why is that? An important problem. It's a problem that John Baylor has pointed out for meta-analysis, and is a problem that doesn't really apply to the causal inference problem because the methodologic literature, as you saw, and the practice are identical. The methodologic literature basically says, look, pick the ones you want, define them the way you want, create rules of inference for them the way you want, and then use them the way you want to use them. And the methods literature tells you that, and the practice literature tells you that. We'll come back to this, because that's a really important problem. So I asked this problem, and this is more from a public health perspective. I mean, the question then becomes, for the individual investigator in epidemiology, for the public health professional, so how much evidence of causation do you need to recommend public health action? How far down the causal chain do you need to be? How close do you need to get to causation before you decide that, in fact, you need to prevent disease? It's a very important question, and that we'll come back to because we don't have good answers to it. And then what I'll show to you is something that you guys are probably familiar with, and every day you probably hear this, but I think it's absolutely incredible that it happens. How is it that different users of these same methodologies look at exactly the same evidence, use exactly the same methodology, and come to exactly opposite claims about causation? And how can that be? I mean, it sounds like a pretty serious matter from a science. I mean, the causal claim is, in fact, a scientific statement. This is a pretty serious concern. Let me show you some examples. This is the alcohol and breast cancer example. Remember this studies. Let me just point out one thing here. I don't know if you can see this, but anyway, Dr. Winder is the author of one of the case control studies, and Dr. Hyatt, we'll come back to this, is an author of one of the cohort studies. We'll come back to this. So, let's talk about these conflicting claims, and here are the reviews. And I'm going to pass on this. Remember the Winder example that I showed you? Remember the conclusion he made at the bottom of that? He said, look, as far as we're concerned, it's not etiologically important. Alcohol and breast cancer are not. Alcohol is not the cause of breast cancer. Almost exactly in the same year, 1 year later, Bob Hyatt looked at exactly the same data that Ernst Winder had looked at. He used exactly the same Surgeon General's criteria, and he said, as far as I'm concerned, I looked at the evidence, and women with risk factors for breast cancer may be wise to limit their use of alcohol. Let me take an even more stark example.
Can you go back now? I mean, those two do not seem inconsistent to me. I mean, they just reconcile those very easily. Couldn't you? His evaluation does not support it, but women who want to be cautious should limit their use of alcohol.
Well, let me go. But that's not what Winder said. Winder said, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing there. Women should not change their behavior as a result of what's out there. And that, to him, was precisely what he said was, it doesn't support it, has nothing to do with it. Hyatt, on the other hand, says, yes, obviously alcohol has something to do with breast cancer, and therefore I'm making a recommendation that women change their behaviors.
I think an average lawyer would read that as people being very careful about the words they chose.
Well,
I mean,
and I can appreciate that, but remember that's, I mean, from your perspective, and I'm not arguing, that's not my perspective, that's our perspective. I mean, let me give you another, even more stark example. 1996, 2 review papers done exactly as I mentioned, and 2 from Karen Michaels and Walt Willett, who are now looking at the question of abortion and breast cancer, used exactly those same methodologies, and Michael says, look, not only is it not causal, there is no association there. And Bryant et al. From New York saying, as far as we're concerned, this is a public health tragedy, and they wrote in their review, 5,000 women a year are dying from breast cancer because they had an induced abortion. Now the question I have is, how can this be? Not from a legal perspective, but how can it be from the perspective of science and public health that 2 different groups looking at exactly the same evidence, using exactly the same methodology, can come to exactly opposite conclusions about what's going on?
Do you think that's necessarily true?
No, I'm saying this is an example.
No, what I'm raising with you is, I'm sorry, what you're positing is that they're looking at the same information.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting to you it's possible that there was something else they were looking at. Maybe they had some other motivation in the way they were looking.
Well, now we're going to get to how we might answer this question, and I do have answers for how we can explain the 2 differences in these 2 particular examples. We'll get right to that. So thank you for anticipating where we're headed. So I believe this to be a very fundamental problem from a methodological perspective, from a theoretical perspective, and from a practical perspective. And there's some, it's a simple difference of opinion. That's not very helpful. Here are 2 potential answers. One is that there are different methodological choices going on. And I pointed out to you that in this practice of causal inference, there are a lot of choices to make in this methodology. You choose which criteria you use, and you choose the rules of inference that are attached to those criteria. So that might explain the difference. And then there's this thing called values that might be playing a role. Social values, moral, political, religious values that might be playing a role in these assessments. Just to make a point about differences of opinion, these are differences of opinion in our discipline about whether we should use meta-analysis or not. Everywhere from, yes, it's a very productive sort of methodology, to it's a bad concept, statistical alchemy, and abracadabra. Just to show you the sort of strength of opinion about the methodology itself. Yes, ma'am?
If you don't mind, remind us the meta-analysis definition.
How does that work? A meta-analysis is basically a way to take the results of studies, cohort studies, case control studies, or randomized clinical trials, and summarize those studies into a single result from the studies. Very simply put, it's a quantitative technique. Thanks. Good. 5 minutes, perfect. So these are the sort of choices that you have in the use of these interpretive methods that I'm talking about. You could select different studies for review, although that doesn't explain the 2 examples I showed you. You could pick different causal criteria. You could assign different rules of inference to those criteria. You could prioritize those criteria differently, and of course you might or might not use meta-analysis. And here are the sort of list of the potential values that may be playing a place in these decisions. What is wish bias? And this is where I pointed out that Hyatt had published one of these studies, and Winder had also published one of these studies. Winder's study of case control of alcohol and breast cancer was a negative study. Hyatt's study was a cohort study and was a positive study. But with negative meaning that he found no association. And I remember I showed you that review. He looked at the whole review, but his individual study was a, quote, negative study. Now, is it possible that the writer of a systematic review of that literature, their overall conclusion might be consistent with the specific conclusion of their individual study in a controversial situation? And in fact, in this case, it precisely is. Winder's negative case control study, an extraordinarily negative review of the literature. Hyatt, positive cohort study, and a positive review. Am I saying that that always happens? No, I'm not saying it. Am I saying that it is a possibility and one of the sort of values, contextual values that may play a role? Absolutely. Moral positions, cultural norms, there are a variety of potential values here. Just to go into depth now, what really explained the difference between Winder and Hyatt, and I'll just bring this up, but I want to show you that they in fact use both the same criteria. You all remember Winder's consistency criterion, the first one, where he said there were 7 out of 13 case control studies positive and 4 out of 5 cohort studies positive. He said this is not consistent. That's a very peculiar interpretation of consistency in epidemiology. Extremely peculiar. Everyone pretty much uses a sort of 50% cutoff. I mean, that's sort of, for a group of studies all equally done well, you can sort of say, well, geez, if over 50% of them, that argues more for consistency than against it. Winder had decided, apparently, that his rule for consistency was 100%. And if he didn't reach 100%, therefore it was not consistent. Did you notice his appreciation of temporality? Now, we didn't talk about ecologic studies here, but nobody uses ecologic studies to evaluate temporality. If anything, you would look at a cohort study, as Leon pointed out. That's where you take a population of exposed people who don't have the disease and follow them. They don't have the disease yet. So if you get a positive result in a cohort study, you can, for all practical purposes, say that temporality has been met. That had been met at the time Winder wrote this review. So because of his sort of peculiar rules of inference that he assigned to these criteria, he came up with a very negative assessment relative to Hyatt's, which was very positive. And what about the other example? Joel Bryan, who was the guy that wrote that report of abortion and breast cancer, had an interview with the Boston Globe reporter. He said basically, look, I'd already made up my mind before I wrote that review. And I wrote that review for a specific purpose. And this is in the Boston Globe. I wanted to give state legislators justification for passing laws requiring doctors to warn women about the risk. So an incredible example of a way to bias the results of a causal analysis based on personal, in this case, personal moral views. So what do we have here? This very important methodology, answering this very important question of general causation. What kind of a methodology is this? It's a qualitative method primarily, with a lot of quantitative input. The qualitative part, all those words: consistency, strength, dose response, biologic gradient, and some of them have quantitative inputs. Strength refers to the magnitude of relative risk. Quite an incredible selection, subject to the selection and prioritization of the criteria and the rules of evidence. They're obviously used to make the causal claims and to buttress public health recommendations. And a whole lot of stuff goes into it when these sorts of assessments are made. Judgment, our experience, traditions, values, and just about everything else. And that's all I have to say for you today. We can talk a little, sorry about that. I'll take questions, and then if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about the research that we're doing at the NCI to make progress in what I think is a very fundamental methodological problem. Yes, sir.
Do you have any suggestions to us in regard to making a determination as to when the methodology is so skewed that we should really just exclude it, as opposed to allowing methodology to be attacked by cross-examination?
Well, I think the step one, and this is applied, this is as important to us as it is to you. If someone says, look, I'm going to talk to you about general causation of some particular factor in some particular disease, I would say to them, okay, then let's go through these steps I just mentioned. What's the evidence that you're going to use to make that assessment? Where did you get the evidence from? Secondly, if you're going to look at it in terms of causation, what conditions, criteria, guidelines are you actually going to use? What are your definitions of them? And what rules of inference are you going to use associated with each one? Now, you may say, well, that's not very helpful. I'm not sure which one of those are good. My concern is right now, we haven't even got to the place where we expect our folks to do that ourselves. Bottom line is, causal analysis in epidemiology has been stagnant for 40 years, and it's an extraordinarily subjective process. So the best you can do at this point is say, tell me how you're doing. That's it.
So,
Following up on Chuck Brock, San Francisco, following up on that question, let's say you have this, these results of where one person says, yes, there is a cause, the other person says no, then you start to explore it, and you discover that on the consistency criteria, they're using two different sets. One saying it has to be 100%, the other saying it has to be more likely than not. What does that tell, what does the judge do? I mean, you have, how do we know? How do we have any sense at all as to what criteria is really the scientifically valid criteria, and therefore we simply let it go to the jury?
I know. It's a wonderful question, because I cannot point you to a place in our literature that will answer that question for you. It does not exist, and that's the problem. You can talk to Leon, you can talk to Kurt, you can talk to every excellent, extraordinary epidemiologist in the country, and they will tell you what they think. They may say, yeah, I think 50% for consistency is a pretty good rule. I think if the magnitude's less than 2, that's really a problem. But there is no theoretical basis.
But is there an acceptable consensus among recognized epidemiologists as to what consistency means?
It is not written down. So if it exists, it is a matter of sort of a verbal consensus. Now, I'm absolutely serious. I am not dodging your question. You would get different opinions from different people on how to prioritize these, everywhere from someone as senior as Rothman saying, forget about them, don't use them, and to which I would say, okay, fine, what do you use? What's the replacement? To each individual person saying, well, this is how I do it. Take it or leave it. It's an extraordinary situation. I do say so myself.
You mentioned that Hill's methodology is the sacred cow in your world of 40 years ago. Are the medical schools bored, or nobody wants to think about a new methodology, or it's just perfect and there's no point in coming up with an alternative?
It's an interesting question. No, there has been very little research done on improving this methodology. We've done a little bit. I may be one of the only people in the country that has done much research on this, and one person isn't enough. We started off with research just sort of outlining what is the practice, how does it actually take place, so that we have something to proceed from and comparing it to the methods. Let me give you an example just of a research project that we're currently finishing up right now that I can tell you very quickly. As I mentioned, in 1964, the Surgeon General decided that smoking caused lung cancer and it caused laryngeal cancer, but they said, but as far as we say right now, it does not cause esophageal cancer and bladder cancer. In 1982, the Surgeon General put a new committee together, used exactly the same criteria, and went back and looked at the information again, and they changed their mind about esophageal cancer. So here is an example in the practice. It's an empirical example in the practice of how much evidence does it take to get from I don't think it's causal to I think it's causal, from a group perspective in the Surgeon General's committee. So that's something, I don't have the data to show you, but that's an example of a research project. The other way to go about this is from the theoretical perspective. What are the theories of causation that would lead me to make some suggestion about the sort of minimum level of relative risk that I would accept as causal, as one example? What is the minimum threshold number? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 1.1? And what is the basis for making that kind of a statement? That literature, that research has not been done. So we're sort of in a state of, hopefully we'll get more folks involved. It's not a high priority in the research arena because the high priority is on the big studies. You get $1.5 million to do a case control study, and a study like I'm talking about costs, what, $10,000 or something. So just think about that. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to go back to the question that was asked earlier. I know that what you're telling us is there's no set agreement on some of these values, but surely there is some agreement on what wouldn't be acceptable. I mean, it couldn't be that we couldn't find a number that none of you would think would be acceptable, right?
Well,
I mean, that's the kind of thing.
let me just say one thing about that. You can easily, and a lot of people do this, say, let me tell you what the data would look like that I'm convinced that it's causal. I can tell you that, and we all agree about it. Essentially 100% consistency, extremely high relative risks, an extraordinarily perfect dose-response curve, lots and lots of evidence from biologic mechanism, a very specific association, we've got a randomized trial, etc. I can do that, but that's not what the problem is. That's very unusual to have all of that laid out. The problem is really, the question we need to have the answer to is what's the least amount of evidence that you need to make a causal claim? And that's a really hard one to answer unless you do it one of two ways. Either you do it empirically, like I'm suggesting, go back into the past and say, at what point have we made decisions that we are now agreeing that an association is causal? How much evidence existed at the time we made that decision? That is a good estimate of what the evidence ought to look like. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is from this theoretical perspective. That's the only way to answer those questions, is either historically. It's a case study kind of approach. You guys would appreciate that in the law. It's a very similar sort of thing. Linking the evidence at the time to what was actually happening. Joel, yeah.
I'd like to come back to the judge's question in the front about how do we decide between 100% consistency and preponderance of the evidence when a case comes into a courtroom and the judge has to make an evaluation. It may be that this is an appropriate division of labor between the scientific community and the legal community, that the judge can lay out to the jury, or if he or she's going to make the decision himself, what consequences would follow from 100% consistency as the standard, and what consequences would follow from a preponderance of evidence as a standard for consistency, and what consequences would follow from intermediate standards of consistency between preponderance and 100% consistency. And then make a selection of the criterion based on the purpose of the decision that has to be reached in the case. So the scientist tells you, if you have 100% consistency, you get this outcome. If you have 75% consistency, you get this outcome. If you have 51% consistency, you get this outcome, A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And now the judge says, I've got to make a decision in a practical case. For my purposes, for social justice, for economic rationality, for all the other things that don't have to do with the pure science of the case, I'm going to pick the 74% standard.
Well, Joel, yeah, I appreciate that. Maybe that's what y'all are welcome, free to do. Maybe you're using consistency in a slightly different way, but we don't have an answer to the question. So if it's 100% consistency by itself, that's what this means. I can't take that consistency itself out of the context of the other factors that I'm using to decide causation. I just can't do it. It's not just about consistency. It's about strength of the evidence. It's about, maybe, like I said, maybe you're using that word in a different sense, but in the sense that we actually use it, that's one of 9 or 5 or 6 or 8 things that you have to think about. And yes, you can set up all of those sort of parameters, but we don't have any good sense of, except from a sort of empirical, historical perspective, whether any one of those sets means anything. That's the problem. Yes, sir.
Dan Race in Alabama. It seems that the problem is that in epidemiology, you've not decided which system describes the underlying reality.
Well, I like that one. That's one of those philosophical questions. Well, in a sense, you're right in this piece of it. We have not decided on the sort of, precisely as we should, on the methodology that's used to make a causal assessment. In contrast, we have decided, and we've done an excellent job, of putting the studies together that Leon was talking about. You've seen incredible progress in how cohort studies are maintained and how they're done and how they're analyzed, case control studies and randomized trials. So there's been a very dynamic process, and those things are solid epidemiology. I don't want you to get the sense from this that we haven't made good decisions about causation. Smoking does indeed cause lung cancer. Diethylstilbestrol does indeed cause vaginal cancer. The AIDS virus does cause AIDS. So we have made good decisions. The problem is really mostly in these controversial issues in which we don't. The methodology then, typically because the evidence is not so obvious, that we have trouble because our methodology just does not have the kind of discriminative value that we would like it to have. Bottom line. Yes, sir.
Bruce Jenkins, I think implicit in everything that others have said is a recognition that there's a great difference in causation law and causation science. The quality of knowledge that we use in deciding human questions, human conduct questions, may relate to the quality of the underlying data in a scientific study, or the quality of inference that one may draw from the underlying data. But our purposes in dealing with causation in law is a resolution of a dispute as a human conduct. And that kind of causation, value-wise, as you pointed out, is greatly different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Greatly different.
It
from the
is
so-called
right.
scientific cause.
Well, let me just point something out to you, because I agree with you that, you, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have a different reason for answering the question of general causation. We also have a reason for answering the general causation that has to do with human conduct. Our interest in answering the question is because we want to go out and prevent disease. We want to employ interventions out in the public. So we need an answer to the question too. And interestingly enough, as I suspect it is true in the courtroom, it's not necessarily true that you make a strong claim about causation before you make a decision about human conduct. The same precisely has taken place in epidemiology and public health. And in fact, those alcohol and breast cancer examples were really good examples of that. Dr. Hyatt went out and said, he didn't say, I know alcohol causes breast cancer. No, what he said was, there's enough evidence there for me to suggest that women should limit their use of alcohol. So he went ahead and made the preventive recommendation. The strength of his causal inference was somewhat in question. Fundamentally, in public health and epidemiology, the question we want to have an answer to is not so much causation as it is what should prevention look like. That's really the underlying question. And perhaps part of the reason that we have permitted so much variation and variability in this process of causal inference. Now, sometimes we would really like to have a stronger claim. And Austin Bradford Hill said this beautifully. He said, depending on the intervention, the human conduct involved, I might look at different amounts and different strengths of evidence. So if the question isn't in of itself general causation, but rather prevention, or some decision about human conduct, then the standard, the weight, can change depending on the circumstances. Nevertheless, even in that kind of a situation, you still have to ask the question, so how much evidence do I need to act in this particular case? And we can all agree, as someone pointed out, that there's absolutely no evidence, then we would all pretty much agree, well, we don't do anything. And if the evidence is so incredibly strong that no one in their right mind knows anything about it would disagree, we'd say, well, obviously. Well, those are the two extremes, and when we're very fortunate when we have those, that's not typically the case. We're down here in the middle somewhere. And
We're all down here.
yeah. Well, as Oscar Wilde put it, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the star.
If we didn't have questions for decisions, if we didn't have probabilities, we're talking description. We're not talking resolution.
I think I am unfortunately going to have to terminate this because we want to give you a chance to have a cup of coffee. We want the other speakers to have a chance to speak, and we will, at the end of this program, have all of the panelists up here for a discussion of some of these questions.